Timothy chapter 2 this morning, continuing our series there. Back in verse 8 we had remember Christ Jesus, risen from the dead. Now in verse 14 we have remind them, remember and remind them. We'll take up the reading here in verse 14. Remind them of these things and solemnly charge them in the presence of God not to wrangle about words, which is useless and leads to the ruin of the hearers. Be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth. But avoid worldly and empty chatter, for it will lead to further ungodliness, and their talk will spread like gangrene. Among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, men who have gone astray from the truth, saying that the resurrection has already taken place, and they upset the faith of some. Nevertheless, the firm foundation of God stands, having this seal: the Lord knows those who are His, and everyone who names the name of the Lord is to abstain from wickedness. In this portion here, there's work to be done, and there's workman highlighted, a good workman and a bad workman. If any man aspires to the office of an overseer, it's a fine work he desires to do. There's work to be done, and he's speaking here about those that are doing it. And the work is teaching and preaching. And the tools of the trade, if you could call it that, are the words of truth. And by extension, these verses in the Bible, in this portion of the Bible, they apply to all of us, and I realize what's being the application right here, the context, is preaching, teaching. But nonetheless, it ought to cause us to be diligent in regard to our words. Otherwise, you might as well skip over this and say that only applies to the preacher. So there are two types of workmen here, a good workman and a bad workman. And an example in this context is given to each one. It's implied Timothy is the good workman. And the handling of these tools of our trade, that is, the words of truth, in the work is either an embarrassment and unapproved. He uses the word ashamed. Or it is approved and commended. Be diligent to show yourself approved. So you've got both of these in this context here. Now, initially I want to skip over verse 14 and talk about the good workman in verse 15, and then we'll address this matter of the bad workman. So the good workman, we see here that he's diligent. The King James says study. The ESV says do your best. So they kind of contain the same idea here. A good workman does his best. He puts effort into it. He tries. He studies. He takes seriously his calling, and he makes efforts in the study and the preparation to present something that is pleasing to God and good for his hearers, because hearers have been mentioned in this portion. Now we see that he's approved, but it's not popular favor that he's after. It's divine approval. And often the case is the preacher's not approved by everybody who hears him, because sometimes he's got to say hard things. Sometimes he's got to be to the point. Sometimes he's got to make an application that hurts. Someone might bristle at that. Oh, it's talking about me. You're preaching at me. I've had people say that before. You preaching at me. My response was, yes, I was, along with everybody else present. So he's not going for the approval of men, but the approval of God here. That's the only one that really counts. And he's approved, and the word is like precious metals are proved before they're accepted as being genuine. They pass inspection. They get the stamp of approval. You know, when this church building was under construction, there's a big pile of drawings that had to be stamped. And Alan got the drawings, and his boss stamped them, and they were approved. They were official. It's kind of the idea here. Approval. Be diligent to present yourself approved to God. And as we go on, we see that it's accuracy, accurately handling the word of truth, that's highlighted at the end of the verse. It's part of the approval of God. Is this workman accurately handling the word of truth? Now, you might be interested to know this word accurately, accurate handling of the word of truth means in the original language, he cuts it straight. That's kind of interesting there, I found. He cuts it straight. And all the commentators, they have their various speculations where this metaphor was taken from. They say, well, it's taken from the priest cutting up the sacrifice. He cuts it at the joint, and he does a good job so that it doesn't look like an animal that's been torn by another vicious animal. And some commentators say, well, it's taken from a father cutting up a loaf of bread for his family. And someone else said it's taken from a farmer. He's plowing one side of the field to the other, and he cuts a straight furrow. And it could be, I'm not here to cast doubt on any of those speculations, but in my opinion, what is being talked about here is cutting a path through a tangled up forest or wooded land. He cuts a straight path. He cuts it straight. It does not say that he's approved because he's eloquent in his handling of the truth. Eloquence, it is valuable if you have it naturally. Probably not too good to strive for it, but if a man has eloquence, it's definitely to his advantage to be eloquent. But it's not indispensable. What is indispensable is cutting it straight. You got to cut it straight. You have to be accurate and plain. The teacher does as he cuts a path through the landscape with his exposition of the truth and the application of it. Otherwise, it doesn't do any good. So we as teachers and preachers, those of us that stand behind this pulpit, give exhortations or whatever the case might be, we ought to make efforts to improve our communication skills, because words are our tools. A lot of the time, if you prepare something to share up here, you might realize this more and more. There's a right way of saying something. There's a right word to use. Sometimes I struggle just to find the right word. And there are helps, that you can look up. Words that mean the same thing that are maybe more clear to a particular audience. That's what I'm talking about. Communication skills, when words are our tools. We should try to say things that are clear. We make efforts that way. We do our best, like the ESV said. So this one is approved. He cuts it straight. He's not confusing. He tries to make the path easy to follow, and he kicks the stumbling blocks out of the way, if you can imagine the scenario. Part of the job as a communicator and going through the Bible is, here's a stumbling block, you figure out a way to get it out of the way so it's not, people aren't stumbling over it anymore. And sometimes the way you say things really makes a big difference. I've asked men before, other preachers, I'm battling with this verse right here. I've got a mental block. Can you paraphrase it for me? And he says, well, how about this? And he says a paraphrased version of it, and I say that helped. That did it. That fixed that. It kicked the stumbling block out of the path, you see. So he takes great care to not make the way crooked and difficult to navigate. He cuts it straight. That's in exposition, we call it. What is exposition? It's a fancy name, but it holds this word expose in there, and really that's all it means. You take a verse and you expose it to the congregation. Analysis, but not only that, in the presentation of it. And so Timothy is an example of a good workman here. It's implied, you, Timothy, be diligent, present yourself approved, and be that good workman. And this good workman, when he looks over what he's done, he has no reason to be ashamed of it. Now, that is not sermon crafting. That's not me coming away from a meeting and being proud because I made a good sermon. That's sermon crafting as an end in itself. Produce a good oratory. Something that's witty, something that's new, something that grabbed the congregation and produced emotions. Or that's nothing more than manipulation. It's not talking about that here. But it is saying, if you don't do due diligence in the study, when you come away, what have you done but confuse people? You ought not to be proud of that. You ought to be ashamed of that. You don't want to be that. You don't want to be a shameful workman, but a good one. So Timothy, Paul is telling him, you need to be that. So now the bad workman. Verse 14, I said we would speak on that later, so drop back to verse 14. Paul says, remind them of these things. I think he's talking about the previous verses. And solemnly charged them in the presence of God. Whoa. That's pretty serious, isn't it? He didn't just say give them a lesson or a few tips or a few pointers. He said charge them, and he invoked the presence of God in it. Now that tells you there's weight to words. There's a lot of weight to words, especially words from a pulpit. He invokes the presence of God and gives them this solemn charge. For what does he give the solemn charge? Idolatry? Immorality? Worldliness? Greed? Any of those major things? No. He gives them a solemn charge against word battles, empty chatter, and mishandling the truth. Those things are contained in these verses we just read. Now, the metaphor here, instead of cutting a straight path through the woods, like in the first one, the metaphor here is missing the target, aiming at a target and missing it. That's what the original language means from verse 18, when they have gone astray from the truth. It means they've missed the target. That's what Strong's tells me. They've missed the mark. They've deviated. They've swerved. Some versions might use the word swerve. In 1 Timothy 1, we had it, some men straying from these things have turned aside to fruitless discussion. They've missed the mark. Same word. And Paul, in his first letter to Timothy, chapter 6, he talked about opposing arguments of what is falsely called knowledge, which some have professed and gone astray from the faith. Same idea. They've missed the target, missed the mark. The teaching is off. The workman is deviated and he's missed the mark. The point of impact is wrong. He's gone wide afield and it's inaccurate. That's one way in which a bad workman works. He misses the mark. Then there's another way. And it's talked about in verse 14. There is wrangling. Literally disputing on trifles. Wrangling about words. People get involved in those. Doing battle over words. Nowadays it's easier than ever to get involved in those kinds of things. Trifling about words, wrangling about things. Especially on social media. It's easy to do. And Paul has some words to describe that. He says, it's useless. Literally, it's not profitable. And not only that, it leads to the ruin of the hearers. So there's a pit to avoid here. Some of the commentators said it's overanalyzing and interpreting into oblivion. That's how he described wrangling about words. It seems to be a type of hair splitting or straining at gnats, and frequently the case is, isn't it, the big picture is better? Pull back and get the big picture of this. And I guess that would be opposite to wrangling over words. So there's a pit to be avoided there. And in other places, we saw it as we moved through the pastoral epistles, Titus 3 and 1 Timothy 6. There are foolish controversies that need to be avoided, and strife and disputes there about the law. He says they're unprofitable and worthless. He used the word worthless there. And then there's another case in which controversy is involved. Someone has a morbid interest in controversy, controversial questions, and disputes about words. And now notice the way this plays out. I'm talking about 1 Timothy 6:4, out of which arrive envy and strife and abusive language, evil suspicions, and constant friction. You see, words matter, and disputes and pursuits of controversies and getting embroiled in word battles and things like that, they matter. Because the end result is strife, evil suspicions, think the worst of someone, suspect them in a bad way, and constant friction. What does constant friction produce? Produces a blister, or it produces a callus, or if there's enough friction there, it produces a fire. You can start a fire simply on friction. So those are bad things. Paul tells Timothy to avoid them. Stay out of that, he says. Don't go that way. This is the way of the bad workman. Engaging them in debate, it only makes things worse. Digs a deeper hole. Things become heated, and by giving attention to those things, in effect, we're advertising the battle. And who loses? the name of Christ loses. You know, you can stamp on a fire trying to put it out, and all it does is spread sparks. Have you ever seen that? It's better just to take the fuel away and let it burn itself out. Furthermore, he says it's damaging to the church. He uses these words: it causes more ungodliness. It leads people in the wrong direction, away from God. And it not only that, it spreads, he says, like gangrene, like an infection. That is, it's poisonous to the whole body. You have an infection here, it starts here, but it ends up everywhere. And then he says, it upsets the faith of some. That was in verse 18, talking about Hymenaeus and Philetus. It leads to the ruin of the hearers. That's at the end of verse 14. And it leads to further ungodliness. So, these things are damaging to the church. This portion that says it leads to the ruin of the hearers, you might find it helpful to understand the Greek word right there is the word that we get catastrophe from. It leads to catastrophe in the church. I mean, it's spelled with a K, but it's the exact word in the Greek that we get catastrophe from. So these kinds of things that we've been speaking about here, now it's easier to see why Paul instructs Timothy to solemnly charge them in the presence of God to not go that way. Avoid all of that. Hendrickson, a man that I read frequently when I study, says by adversely affecting an ever-increasing proportion of the membership, it will tend to destroy the organism of the church. Spreads like gangrene, like an infection. So we might ask ourselves some questions from time to time. What are the likely results of my involvement in this controversy, in this word battle, in this dispute? What are the likely results? That's a good question to start with. At best, the conclusion might be, well, it's unprofitable, and it's likely to be unprofitable and worthless. And I might counsel someone that way if they came to me and said, what about this? Shouldn't I address that? Shouldn't I take this on? I might say, you know, in the end, I think it's going to be unprofitable and worthless. At best, it might be that. At worst, the conclusion might be, this is going to damage the church, where the church is. It might be destructive to someone's faith. He talked about that here. Overthrowing the faith of some. And it's going to be no small thing someday to stand before God and give an account. We're told we're going to give an account for every idle word. What about an account of how the controversies that we got drawn into damaged the church by overthrowing someone's faith? And that's what the word means, upsetting the faith. It means overthrowing the faith of some brother or some sister, or it led to further ungodliness in others, or it even ruined others. So these things have real consequences. They're either honoring or dishonoring to God, and as to their effect, they either edify the church or they do damage to it. So I said Timothy was an example of a good workman. Well, we also have in this text examples of a bad a bad workman. Actually, he gives two of them, and he calls them by name, Hymenaeus and Philetus. And apparently they were well known in the Ephesian district where Timothy was at. They were in the church as professing Christians, and Timothy would have been aware of them. Otherwise, Paul wouldn't even have mentioned their names. It would have been immaterial who these people were if he didn't know them. So he knew them, and Paul says they've gone astray from the truth. So evidently he's not just describing someone who had a difference of opinion. We're not talking about just having a difference of opinion over a debatable matter. We're talking about people here who had a major error with grave consequences in that they overthrew the faith of some in the church. And not surprisingly, their error centered around the physical resurrection. They were denying that somehow. Most likely, it was a heresy that had already gotten started in the early church, known as Gnosticism, and it's a pretty complicated heresy, as a lot of them seem to be. But among other things, it was believed that all matter was evil. And since our bodies are made up of matter, then our bodies are evil and they won't be resurrected. In a nutshell, that was kind of the way the thought process went. They were saying the resurrection has already taken place. They apparently assigned some kind of a spiritual application to the resurrection rather than an actual physical one. Now, we know that Paul isn't going to let that stand. We've got 1 Corinthians 15. That entire chapter is devoted to the resurrection of Christ. And in that chapter, he says, if it has been preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how do some among you say that there's no resurrection of the dead? If there's no resurrection of the dead, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is also in vain. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless, and you're still in your sins. Then those who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. And that's a portion right there that shows you how important it is to have a clear view and understanding of the resurrection. It was a physical reality. So we've got good workmen and bad workmen, and the things that either make them approved, of which they have no reason to be ashamed, or, on the other hand, you could say you ought to be ashamed of yourself for pushing that, saying that. Now, I want to finish with the last consideration, verse 19. Nevertheless, he says, the firm foundation of God stands, having this seal. The Lord knows those who are his, and everyone who names the name of the Lord is to abstain from wickedness. So God's true church, it stands on this doubly sealed foundation. And I point out that it's not merely inscribed, it's sealed, and there's a difference between an inscription and a seal. And the first part of the seal is the Lord knows those who are his. And I would say, in passing, that's universal. He knows all of those who are his. Those who make up the true church, his children, he knows them. I know my children. You know your children. Children that I see in public and in Walmart, I don't know them. But my own children I know. God's the same way. He knows his children. He knows all of them. He knows them intimately. That's what the word is. He knows them intimately. Perfectly he knows them. You scrutinize my path and my lying down, said the psalm writer, and are intimately acquainted with all my ways. He knows you as his child, intimately, perfectly. He knows us eternally. Says he chose us in him before the foundation of the world. He knew me long before I ever had any thought of him. He knew me, birthed me into his family, adopted me, I became his child. That's the first side of the seal. The second side of the seal, everyone who names the name of the Lord. King James says Christ, names the name of Christ, is to abstain from wickedness. And again, how universal this is. Everyone. Applies to all of God's children. So he knows all of them, and all of them have to fit the second part of this seal, abstain from wickedness. Everyone who names the name of Christ. We're told that the Christians, the disciples, were first called Christians in Antioch. They took up the name in an official sense of Christ there. Christian, Christ's name. So imagine, if you can, one who names the name of Christ. He says he's a Christian, and you look at him and he does not avoid iniquity at all. Hasn't departed from iniquity. What's your conclusion? This can't be a true Christian, no matter what he says. It's not the real thing. And every honest person despises a fake when it's put forward as being the real thing. If you go to eBay and you buy something and you spend a lot of money and you think you're getting an original, and lo and behold, you discover somebody's been making these as a knockoff of the original, you're pretty put out by it. The real thing, the original, it's got this stamp on it. And it's a twofold seal here, just like two sides of the same coin. They're both necessary. And the seal signifies a few things. One, it warns against tampering. Put a seal on something, it warns against tampering, because you've got the occasion where Jesus, in the tomb, they wanted a seal put on there. The Jews did. They asked Pilate to put a seal on there. So because they had this theory the disciples were going to come and steal the body. So they put a seal on there. That seal secures it against tampering. So here we have this twofold seal on the believers of the Lord, his children. And it warns against tampering. It's a protection. If you do damage to these people, they've got God's seal on them. God doesn't take that lightly. It signifies ownership in the Bible I'm talking about. Aaron had on his turban this pure gold plate on there, and the engraving of a seal was on it, and it said, "Holy to the Lord," on Aaron's turban. I like that idea. Signifies possession, ownership. Holy to the Lord. Seals also certify that which is authentic. Paul told the Corinthian church, "You're the seal of my apostleship in the Lord." It's authentic. So we've got this seal here on this firm foundation. It's a protection, it signifies ownership, signifies it's authentic. The Lord knows those who are his, and everyone who names the name of Christ is to abstain from wickedness. Now, this first seal, the Lord knows those who are his. It's hidden from our view. It's in the realm of the unseen. The Lord knows that. It's speaking about the witness and the wisdom of God. We're told in another place, the Good Shepherd, he knows his sheep, calls them by name. So God knows his own children. That's unseen from me. But the second seal is outwardly observable. That's the way you live, the way you walk. I can see that. I can't see into your heart, only God. God knows that, those who are his. But I can observe the life. So while only God can see and discern the heart, you and I, we have to observe the outward life and make our conclusions accordingly. The lifestyle evidences the heart's condition. That's a principle of the Bible. You know them by their fruit. Are there desires for holiness? Are there efforts being made to abandon those practices that displease God? So how a person responds to revealed truth, that's a real indicator, a general real indicator of the state of their heart. So in this seal, this two-sided seal, we have God's decree on one side. He knows those who are his. And then we have man's responsibility on the other side. If you're going to name the name of Christ, abstain from wickedness. God's decree, man's responsibility. I can't see the one, but I can see the other. It's not to me to determine who are God's children. It's to me to live responsibly as my duty before God, abstain from wickedness. The first is dated in eternity. God knows me from eternity, before the foundation of the world. The second one is in real time. I've only got one chance at this, to live my life. I live it with the duty, the responsibility to abstain from wickedness, according to this seal. So you see, eternity, present day time, my lifespan, whatever that is. The first is a consolation. It's a consolation to me. I receive comfort to know that God knows those who are his. That is a consolation to me. I like that word nevertheless there. I can't tell sometimes where people are at, and sometimes the ones you thought were going to hold out to the end turn out to wash out. And what can you say? Nevertheless, the Lord knows those who are his. There's a consolation there in the first one. In the second one, there's that exhortation to me, to you. One side of the seal, we're required to believe that God knows those who are his. The other side of the seal exhorts us to obey as a result of that belief. The first one has justification in view. The Lord knows those who are his. He justified them. He paid a high price for them. Justification is in view there. The second highlights sanctification. I need to be, because of the justification, I need to be about cleaning up my life. It's biblical. It's my duty. The first refers to our security. I'm secure in him. The Lord handles all of that. He knows those who are his. He knows me. He knows you. He knows, Lord, you know that I love you, Peter said. He knows those things. There's security in that. The second is referring to our purity, living a life pure. You have it masterfully exemplified in 1 Corinthians 6:19. The first part of the seal is this: you are not your own. You've been bought with a price. That's the first part of the seal. The second part of the seal is this: therefore, glorify God in your body. You see it right there, don't you? It's just so plain. The two go together. You can't have one without the other any more than you can have a coin stamped one side and not the other. Jesus said on that day in Matthew 7, he would declare to some, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. So you've got both there. They were not known, and what was their practice? Lawlessness. You see how they go together. You can't have one without the other. So anyone who claims to know God, the conclusion is, will lead a life that reflects that claim, if you're going to name the name of Christ. So therein is the seal. It signifies possession, protection, authentication of God's people that make up the true church. Nevertheless, so there are some, like Hymenaeus and Philetus, but nevertheless, you've got this seal, and they're on the people of God, His church, true church. Well, amen.